Okay, so we want to talk about methods of delivering your speech. There are several, and essentially there are four. Um, the first is what we call manuscript reading, where you're reading your speech or reading a story, and that's what your next speech will be. I asked you to pick a children's story to read, and so we'll be doing that. There's also memorized speaking, where you've memorized your speech. Not my favorite method, however, it can be useful, and we'll talk more about that. Then there's impromptu speaking, where you're not prepared to speak. It's on the just on the spur of the moment. Either you've been asked to speak or you've decided to speak without any much in the way of advanced planning. Um, I think I previously mentioned uh, that I was at a town council meeting and I had an opinion and I decided on the spur of the moment to get in front of the mayor and the town council to speak about the park issue. So, and so that's an example of impromptu speech, and you will all get to do impromptu speeches as well. And the last one, which we'll probably spend the most amount of time on, is extemporaneous speaking. And this is where you may have notes, but it's not a manuscript reading. You're not reading it, you're just using some notes uh, as reference. It's more spontaneous. You haven't worked out the specifics of the of your wording, um, and this is usually, in some ways, the easiest to do because it's hard to memorize a speech, and for some people, it's hard to read a speech. But I won't say necessarily it's the easiest way. You will all develop your preferred ways of delivery, but for the most of the speeches, they will need to be extemporaneous. Um, The one example of the memorized speech that we'll do, you've already done it, or you should have done it, is the self-introduction. And you do want to memorize your 60-second commercial or your elevator speech or whatever you want to call it. So theoretically, you've done that one already, and we will do each. Uh, Talking about manuscript reading, essentially you're reading from either a page or something like that, or a teleprompter, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And it gives you the opportunity to craft a careful message. If you're writing a speech ahead of time, you can develop some nice turns of phrase, just the right words, because sometimes when we speak off the top of our head, we don't always pick the best words, the best vocabulary, and sometimes you see people make grammatical errors and things like that. But if you manuscript reading, you can develop your syntax, and it's particularly helpful if you have to speak to the media. And a lot of media is recorded. Somebody makes a slip up and they say something in the wrong way. Well, it's on YouTube forever. Um, and you can probably think of things like that, that have occurred, politicians in particular, or anyone, or a celebrity or something like that, and it's recorded. And that's why usually most politicians and most public speakers who are dealing with the media will be very careful with their words, and that's why they'll maybe read it off of a script. And it does allow for a certain amount of polishing and stylizing, particularly if it's going to be recorded or put out there for posterity. I particularly remember Bill Clinton's inaugural address, and very well written speech. And it actually had um, certain phrases in there that were easy to pull out and use as sound bites. And it was kind of written for sound bites because Clinton was very media savvy, and certainly his speechwriters were. And they knew that the media would pull out sound bites. And the one I remember in particular is "There's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America," which is a nice little phrase or sentence there to use. And the thing is, in general, uh, since it's a script is being written for you, or you're writing the script, you can actually have script writers come. And a lot of politicians don't really write their own speeches. A lot of corporate people don't write their own speeches. In fact, I had a friend who that's his job, was just to be a corporate speech writer, to write for the CEO or other executives who had to make speeches. So, um, There are some disadvantages. It can sound like it's being read. It can be somewhat robotic or wooden. Um, and so it does require a little bit of skill and practice. I have worked with, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. It may require cue cards or a teleprompter with an operator. Does anyone know what a cue card is, or cue cards? Usually it's multiple cards. Anyone?
Isn't that like when you're performing, or like not performing, but like in a specific spot and someone's holding the cards for you to read?
Yeah, exactly right. For instance, um, the late night comedians, the Tonight Show and the Late Show and all those, So, if when Stephen Colbert comes out at the beginning of the show, or any of the other comedians, um, they're doing 5 shows a week, and they have to be, have a routine at the beginning of every. So he and the others have script writers. Um, the comedian or the host will approve the jokes, and they usually they record it around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, based on what has happened that day, what's happened in the news and in other places. And what's happened, the host comes in through the curtain, looks straight ahead into the camera, and then behind the camera is the audience. And so to look like they're making eye contact, the comedian will look either to the left of the camera or to the right of the camera, like they're making eye contact with the audience, and really they're making eye contact with the cue cards. Um, and the what's written on the cue cards won't be completely new to them, because obviously they've approved the jokes, or any other comments they make. Um, but it's hard to retain the entire joke in their head. So they need the cue cards. If any of you are familiar with how Saturday Night Live is normally put together, um, outside of the pandemic period, I know they're doing the show from everyone's apartments and things like that. But during normal times, what they do is during the week they write the show. About Thursday, they have to have the show locked down, because they have to have sets and costumes and things like that. I mean, they'll tweak it a little bit. Then Saturday at 5 o'clock, they do a technical dress rehearsal. So they do everything: lighting, costumes, everything exactly as they plan to do it. Cameras, the whole thing. They even bring in an audience. I'm actually told it's better to go to the technical rehearsal than the final show. They uh, they do the show, and the producers will actually listen to the audience. Oh, that joke really hit. Great, we'll keep that in. That joke didn't quite land, so we'll have to do it. And sometimes they'll actually change the order of the sketches and make other changes. Now, imagine you're one of the players on Saturday Night Live. You've been rehearsing a sketch for a few days, and now at the very last minute, before you go in front of a live national audience, they've changed the script on you, and they actually have to hold up the cue cards for the actors to see them and execute the sketch. And sometimes you'll see them kind of do this strange sort of head turn. You know, what they're really doing is they're checking the cue cards, making sure that they say the right lines. Another tool is a teleprompter, which is actually probably more commonly used these days. As I think I previously said, I used to work in video production, and we would use teleprompters, for people making presentations. Um, Here's sort of a diagram of a teleprompter. Here's our speaker. Um, there's a monitor that usually faces straight up, and the text is reversed. And the reason it's reversed is because it's going to be reflected in either a mirror or a glass plate. Um, and I remember the first time I saw it, I think it was at a national convention. Um, I think it was Jimmy Carter. Came up at the Democratic National Convention. He came up. It was in New York, and there were these two pieces of plate glass that were sort of angled into them. I thought they were like bulletproof glass, but then somebody said, no, that's a teleprompter, and explained how a teleprompter works. And so you have to stand in exactly the right place to see the words, if you're off axis or you're in any other angle, they just look like blank pieces of glass. So people can look through them and see them. Um, and then you also have them for television and video. And you see the person making eye contact. They're really not looking at you, they're looking at the words that are scrolling by. Um, it does take a little bit of practice to work with a teleprompter. Um, it's I often had the experience of having somebody who's never worked with a teleprompter come into the studio, and we have a separate operator, and the words kind of move, and they kind of get a little they see the words moving up through the screen, and they start to speed up because they're afraid the words will disappear. So they speed up, and then the teleprompter operator actually speeds up to make sure there's always enough words for the speaker. And it's usually the first time somebody tries it, it crashes pretty quickly. We never put anyone out live doing it that way. So I always worked with recorded video. Uh, if I wanted, at the time when I was producing video, if I needed a teleprompter and operator, it would probably cost me about $1,500 a day. That's what it would probably cost. They're much cheaper now. In fact, you can buy them for a few $100s. In fact, you could do it without even buying one. There is a website, and I'm going to have to, let's see. I'm going to share this website. Where is the website? So I'm going to have to switch. There's actually a website called qprompter.com. Where is it? Oh, there it is. Okay. Okay, can you all see that now? It says good afternoon. Yes? Okay. And this is basically, it's just a website you can load. I think, I'm thinking, this is actually the basics. I just dropped the text in. I actually typed it in, and then I hit start prompter, and it takes me over the prompter. Now, you notice that the words are nice and big. It's not like looking at a Word document. I usually try to leave a space at the first. I don't never start at the top. And so I'm gonna read from this teleprompter, and you'll see the words will start to move up. Good afternoon. Teleprompters are most often used by politicians and newsreaders and allow for manuscript reading from a video or computer screen. Reading from a teleprompter does require practice to achieve an authentic sounding delivery. Otherwise, the delivery can sound wooden or robotic, which undermines the credibility of the presentation. And you could see giving a whole speech like that. Now, the problem is, I'm going to go to the top of there, it can sound very wooden. And I'll give you another reading there. Good afternoon. Teleprompters, most often used by politicians or newsreaders, allow for manuscript reading from a video or computer screen. Reading from a teleprompter does require practice to achieve an authentic sounding delivery. Otherwise, the delivery can sound wooden or robotic, which undermines the credibility of the presentation. And that was an awful reading of it. So you have to, if you're going to read from either a teleprompter or a script or a cue card, you still have to give it a certain amount of energy. And sometimes when people are reading, they don't do that. So I would encourage you, if you ever use a teleprompter, do a few practice runs. First off, to feel comfortable with the text that's moving, but also to be able to give a certain energy to it. And you guys are about to do your manuscript readings, and so you need to, as you're reading, give energy to the characters and so forth. And the narration you'll put in the right place. So let me get back to my PowerPoint. Okay, so I'm a little ahead. Okay, so that essentially is the way the teleprompter works. And if you get a chance to work with a teleprompter, I would encourage you. It's actually a great experience. We also have memorized speaking. And as I said, your self-introduction should be memorized. Otherwise, I'm not a big fan of memorized speaking. Obviously, there are some advantages. You can have direct eye contact. You won't be looking at any notes. That's great. You can move around freely and gesture, but you really have to know your speech. There are some disadvantages. You can forget, and you start to remember what you were going to say, and that kind of undermines it a little bit. Better to have some notes then if you can't retain it all. And it can sound overly mechanical or rehearsed if you're just trying to regurgitate words, as opposed to express the meaning of those words. Remember, the tone of voice is very important. So you want to be careful of that. That's for both manuscript reading and memorized reading. Um, in general, I'm not a big fan of memorized speaking. Usually, when I see people who are speaking without notes, it's somewhere in between memorized and impromptu. They kind of remember the ideas and memorize the core of the speech without the exact wording. And there are exceptions. I actually, years ago, still working in the video world, got a really cool assignment to videotape an initial public offering at the New York Stock Exchange. And this initial public offering is where a corporation offers its stock to the public for the very first time. And there's a lot of ceremony to it, more than I had ever realized. There is the morning breakfast, where there are speeches that are made by the head of the stock exchange and the head of the company that's going public. There are gifts that are exchanged, speeches and so forth. Um, the part you might be most familiar with, if anyone watches any of the business news channels, or maybe you're a business major, you'll see the ringing of the bell to get the start of the trading day, which is at the New York Stock Exchange is 9:30. So they ring the big bell. That's a bit of publicity, and then they show the first purchase of the stock and the first person to or party to who has bought it but then has turned around and sold it. And so for them it's quite exciting. And my job was to put together a video, and unfortunately I had to use the stock exchange video crew. The cameraman was fine. I said, oh, get that shot, and he got it. And then I had to take the tape. This is how long ago this was. This was using actual videotape as opposed to digital files. And we had to take it up to the edit suite and digitize it, so it could be digitally edited. And we're digitizing the speech that the head of the stock exchange made, a gentleman named Dick Grosso. And the editor is starting to give the same speech, but like 2 or 3 seconds ahead of Grosso. I said, how are you doing this? I mean, what are you, psychic or something? He said, oh, no. He gives the exact same speech every week. Anytime there's an initial public offering, the only thing he changes is the name of the company and the name of the CEO. It's the exact same speech every week. Well, if you have to give the exact same speech over and over again, yeah, you might as well memorize it. So the last one is impromptu, which again there's no preparation made for it. It's off the cuff, as they say. You can move around freely and gesture because there is no script. It's spontaneously and authentically delivered. Yes, you'll probably have a lot of disfluency in an impromptu speech, unless the person speaking is really very confident and very knowledgeable about what they're speaking about. And that's most impromptu speeches are tend to be that way. Some disadvantages, obviously, it's going to be less organized unless you are an expert in the area. Difficult to cite evidence, again, unless you're an expert, and so forth. Extemporaneous speaking is where the major outline points, your central idea, your main points, any supporting details, but you haven't worked out the exact wording. And some advantages of that, it's going to be well organized and researched. This is not an impromptu. I know it's not an impromptu speech. I know extemporaneous sounds like spontaneous, and it certainly should have a spontaneous feel to it, but it is something that is planned ahead. Um, so an audience will see an authentically delivered speech, and the little disfluency, just a little bit, gives it that authenticity, but you don't want too much, because too much disfluency makes it seem like the person is not prepared or not knowledgeable. So there's a balance there. And it does take some time to prepare, just like any other speech outside of the impromptus. And it takes skill to deliver well. And those are the skills we are going to be developing in this class. And yes, notes are usually needed. I almost always bring notes, unless I'm telling a story that I've told, 50 times before. So usually you will need notes. So these are the 4 delivery methods. Are there any questions? Okay, no questions. Characteristics of good delivery. You want to make good eye contact. Now, eye contact is kind of a funny thing. In person, if I make continual eye contact with you, now it's a little hard to reproduce the effect in this situation, but if we're in the room and I'm just staring at you, how would that make you feel?
Scrutinized?
I'm sorry, what?
Scrutinized, maybe?
Scrutinized. Might make you feel a little uncomfortable, right? Yeah, I mean, somebody's staring you down, that sort of thing. It is a little bit, creepy. It's like people have staring contests, but unless you're having a staring contest, it can be a little overbearing. And there is also cultural standards in the United States. Generally, we like eye contact. It's considered appropriate. In fact, if somebody doesn't make eye contact, we tend not to trust them. Now, here's kind of a funny thing. I've known my brother-in-law for over 30 years now. Never quite completely trusted him. Now, he has never done anything. He has never cheated me. He's never done anything to me, but he doesn't make eye contact. It's kind of a funny thing. And other members of the family have also commented on this. Doesn't make eye contact. And so I'm not completely comfortable trusting him. And it's kind of, I mean, he's done nothing that I could see that is, doesn't warrant trust. And I'm, after 30 years, maybe I'm trusting him a little bit. It's just that if he makes eye contact, it's by accident, and he quickly fixes that. He's just somebody who doesn't make eye contact. And eye contact in the United States, we relate to trust. Although too much eye contact can be too much. And it's interesting, people who are autistic learn social skills in the same way that maybe the rest of us learn math. It's not intuitive for them. And there was an autistic gentleman who actually almost put it into a mathematical equation. He said, I need to make eye contact at least 1/3 of the time. Otherwise, people are thinking I'm being evasive. But I can't make eye contact more than 2/3 of the time. Otherwise, people will think I'm being aggressive. And, I kind of love that he put it into a mathematical, a construct there. So, more than 1/3 of the time, less than 2/3. Now, it's a little bit different in other countries where eye contact in general is considered very aggressive and inappropriate and almost insulting. So again, you have to try to understand your audience. Now, when speaking to an audience in general, how can you make eye contact with the entire audience? Well, what you do is you look around. You don't have to make eye contact with every single person, but you have to be seen making eye contact. So, I'll look at somebody over here and I'll look at somebody over there and I'll look at, you, and I try to make eye contact with as many people as I can to be seen making eye contact. You don't, and I know some people put this idea out that you should just speak to one person. That's actually, let's say you have a friend in the audience, just speak to that person. No, because that means you're insulting the rest of the audience. So you should talk to the entire audience. If you're speaking to 100 people, no, you're not going to end up making eye contact with everyone, but you want to be seen making eye contact with people. So another issue is gestures. Um, One of the most common gestures is pointing. And so if I were to point at you, that would probably make you feel uncomfortable. Generally, you don't want to point. Now there are exceptions. John Kennedy, would point a lot, but he would do these things. He would point to the, he goes, "We go to the stars." He'd point. I'm sorry, I can't frame this rightly. He'd point up, and he'd point to the sky, or he would point to the top of his podium. Like if his podium were here, and we do these things because they are hard. Um, he never pointed at people, and that was important. Generally, probably your mother told you pointing is rude, and it is. Actually, if you go to Walt Disney World or Disneyland, I guess, the employees are told never to point. They say, "Excuse me, where's the restroom?" And they can't point over there. They have to do an open-handed type of thing. I'm not doing that very well. Or use two fingers. They never are supposed to point because they might accidentally point at a person. And this is actually a much more a friendlier gesture. Um, so you want to be, so you do that sort of thing. Now, there was a politician who had a bad habit of pointing, sort of wagging his finger. And that was Bill Clinton. And when he was governor of Arkansas, one of his aides said, "Governor, you got to stop pointing. You're wagging your finger." So he said, "Here's what I want you to do. I want you to take your index finger and hold it down with your thumb when you're speaking." And that's why he talks like that. You can see videos of him talking, and he does this thing with his thumb. And it's funny, other politicians start doing the same thing. I don't know if it's because they're holding down their finger or they're just trying to imitate Bill Clinton. But I used to see comedians who are doing impressions of Bill Clinton, do this thing,
Wait, doesn't Obama do that?
He might, he
Yeah.
might, I'm not up on there, but this is something I've seen a lot of politicians do because it prevents them from pointing. And now, again, I don't know if they're just simply imitating Clinton or they're just trying to hold their finger down, because it is tempting to wag your finger. So now Clinton is retired. And he started this new thing. He's like catching up for all the people he didn't point at. He does this sort of thing. That's it. He sort of does, like he's holding something down, but his fingers are always pointed out. I think he's trying to catch up with all the pointing he missed out on. I don't know. But generally, don't point at members of your audience. There's another one, hands on hips. You can't see my entire body, but think of like a drill sergeant walking up and down reviewing the troops with his hands on hips. That's probably something else you want to avoid. It makes people try to seem like self-important and superior. Parade rest is where the hands are behind the back, holding hands behind the back, and the other is called the fig leaf clutch, where you're holding your hands in front of you, which makes it look like you're covering something up. Those are probably gestures you want to avoid. Don't gesture too big. Keep your gestures small, and you can gesture. It can give a certain emphasis. It's hard in this environment because the frames and all. But if you were to just keep your hands at your sides and never move your arms or never move your hands, it might seem a little weird. In fact, years ago, Seinfeld, on the Seinfeld show, they did a whole episode about somebody who was never moved their arms, and that became too weird for them. Gestures do have functions. They emphasize, and sometimes they'll substitute or even contradict. If you do something like that, I would just keep your gestures small. Italians in particular, and I'm married to an Italian, they talk about the big, gestures and wild gesticulating. You want to keep it keep it down, because then what happens if you do that too much? You become the form of parody. If you look at Donald Trump, regardless of what you think of him, he has all these big gestures, and this one, and there's a few others, and he's parodied mercilessly because of his gestures, as well as other things. But so be careful there. Movement. I mean, sometimes you're locked down at a podium because that's where your speech is, that's where the teleprompter is. Sometimes it's because maybe there's a video camera on you. And I remember this one guy, we were videotaping him, and he kept on walking away from the podium, and it was constantly had to sort of follow him, and it got a little tiresome like that. So, but if you don't have a camera on you and you're not tied to the podium, yeah, maybe walking around in the classroom. Since we've never actually met in a classroom, I actually tend to walk around a little bit. It's a way of expelling a little energy. It's a way to be more relaxed with your audience, but there's appropriate times for that. Some people I've seen some speakers actually walk up and down the aisles. I'm not a big fan of that, but sometimes it might be appropriate. You do want to maintain eye contact while moving around. Again, I saw somebody actually walking back and forth, and they're walking back and forth, and they're looking up at the back wall. We were like, what the hell is on the back wall? We just didn't quite. It was just a little weird. Or you don't want to be looking at the floor as you're walking back and forth. Make eye contact as much as you can with the audience. I hate to sound like your mother, but stand up. Have posture. If you're in a room, command the room. You're in charge of that room. You have at least temporarily leadership in that room. And so, if people are slumping down, even in this video situation, I see some people, they're, I don't know, kind of doing like this. What if I gave the entire talk like this? You wonder what the hell's going on. It gives a completely different impression. So you want to be aware of that. You stand up straight. You have more credibility. You seem more like a leader. And, that's what you are. At least momentarily, you are leading the room by giving the talk. So there are also issues of vocal quality and delivery. The volume. Generally, if you're in a room, you're speaking in some room, how loud do you need to speak? Anyone? How loud do you need to be?
Just so everybody can hear you.
I'm sorry?
Just so everybody can hear you.
Yes, who in particular?
Your audience.
Well, okay, but who in the audience?
People in the back.
People in the back. Yeah, I've seen these people who they speak, and the people in the front can hear just fine, but the people in the back can't. So you have to speak loud enough for people in the back to hear. And I always ask, can you hear me in the back? Am I speaking loud enough? Actually, I usually try to say, am I speaking loud enough? Because apparently somebody somewhere got upset. Somebody who's hard of hearing felt insulted that somebody was asking, can you hear me? But it's really asking about one's own performance. You can also drop your voice. Now, I'm not sure how well I'm doing it in this situation because of the microphone, but sometimes you can speak lower and people listen a little harder then. Although if I spoke at this volume too long, you'd probably all get annoyed. But you can drop your volume for emphasis, or you can raise your volume for emphasis. Again, you don't want to be monotone, mono volume. Raise your voice a little, sometimes bring it down. There are reasons, it makes it much more dynamic and much more interesting. Variation is key. The same thing with pitch. Now, pitch is the frequency of your voice. Now, we are all given a certain range, but the certain physicality in our throat, our vocal cords. Some of us, men tend to have deeper voices and women tend to have higher voices. Generally, people find the middle range the most soothing, the most enjoyable to listen to. There are actually actresses who have high squeaky voices. I can't do a falsetto the way I used to. Think of Monty Python. The people, men doing the high falsettos, or maybe an actress who has a really high squeaky voice. And actually, actresses learn to pull their voices down. Those actresses. There's some actresses who have wonderful voices and they don't need to do that. But those who have the higher squeaky voices pull their voices down. There's actually a movie that talks about this. It's called In a World, and it's about voiceover actors, people who do the voices for the trailers and other things. So you want to be aware of that. Now, men tend to be lower. I actually had a friend who was on an airplane one time with James Earl Jones, the guy who voiced Darth Vader and Mustafa. He has the really deep voice. And he said, oh, it was amazing. I mean, he didn't know him. He was just on the same plane, a few aisles away, rows away. And he said, yes, I think I'll have the fish and the chocolate chip cookies. And, he was in first class, obviously. And he said, yeah, he always has to speak like that. Well, he's made a lot of money speaking like that, but I do know James Earl Jones can pull his voice up into a more medium range if he needs to. So, if you probably want to be as middle range as possible. You don't want to be too deep or too high, that sort of thing. But again, a little variation is fine. Then the next thing we want to talk about is articulation or diction. You need to speak clearly. Now, particularly now that we have to communicate through these, through Zoom, and our microphones are not always the best, or there is lag, so we need to be a little bit more careful. In general, we have to be more careful because we have more international audiences. Many of you, some of you maybe were not born in the United States, or you're from another part of the country where the dialect is different, the pronunciations are different, and it's really important to pronounce words clearly. Now, we all, in our everyday conversation, slur our words a bit. So we want to avoid doing that when we're speaking publicly, because there are people who might have difficulty with slurred language. Now, I still do. I enjoy watching British television, British movies. I love the accent. I love the culture. And I could always understand them. But in more recent time, the last few years, the style of acting has changed. It's to be a little bit more natural. So they tend to slur their words more. And if I'm watching something that's recorded, I have to rewind and listen to it again because I couldn't quite make it out. They slurred the word. And if I grew up in Britain and I was familiar with the accents or the dialects more, I wouldn't necessarily have to do that. So you want to be careful about that. And I'm going to give you some examples of common examples of poor articulation. Let me know. No, it's let me know. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. See you later. Should be see you later. Want to go out? Morning. This is called dropping your G's. Morning, doing, singing. Morning, doing, singing. You want to be very careful about that. What do you do? I could understand somebody whose English is not their first language wondering, what the hell did I say? And of course, if you're in New Jersey, you got to say, forget about it, particularly if you watch The Sopranos. When we just run our words together, but when we're speaking publicly, we need to say what we want to say clearly, maybe go a little slower. Pronunciations, you want to be careful of too. Now you see two words there, but they're spelled incorrectly. Can anyone tell me what the first word is supposed to be?
Ask.
Ask, okay. But some people say ax. I ask you a question. You want to be careful about that. I actually knew a a head of human resources who actually, when interviewing prospective candidates, would actually put ASK on a piece of paper and ask the candidates, job candidates, how to pronounce this word. And if they said ask, the interview would continue. If they said axe, well, the interview would continue, but it wouldn't be that long, you know. And he was looking for people who could speak on the telephone and communicate with customers, and he wanted proper pronunciations. What's the second word supposed to be? Anyone? Come on.
Nuclear?
Nuclear. Yes. Who said nuclear?
I
What?
did.
No. What? I don't mean you. Who
Oh.
said some famous person used to say nuclear? All right, maybe it's
Wasn't it Bush?
George Bush. Yes, George Bush, President Bush. He would talk about nuclear weapons. And of course, he got a lot of heat for that. Even his wife made fun of him. She said, "Unlike my husband, I can say nuclear." The funny thing is, he was not the first president to say nuclear. The first one was Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. President Eisenhower actually had a stroke while in office. This is before the 25th Amendment. And he was still president while in the hospital. About 3 days later, he came out. It was a minor stroke, luckily. But one of the side effects was that he could no longer say nuclear. He had to say, it would come out nuclear. And the funny thing is, it was a word that most people were not yet familiar with. You have to understand, this is only about 5 or so years after the atomic bomb went off. And people knew the word atomic, but most people didn't know the word nuclear. You know, science education wasn't at the level it is today. And so if actually you can find some old movies from that era, and if the word is used, the actors will say nuclear because the president said nuclear. And there is sort of this thing where a leader of a country says something in a certain way, other people will say it the same way. For instance, if anyone is familiar with the Castilian accent in Spain, instead of Valencia or gracias, they would say Valencia or gracias. And actually, when I was in Spain, I don't claim to have any great fluency in Spanish, but I know a few words, and I tried, and I had to adapt to the Castilian accent. And this is all because there was a king who had a lisp, and he spoke with a lisp, and so people imitated the king, not as a way of ridiculing the king, but actually a way of complimenting and following. A similar way, I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Palace of Versailles in France. Beautiful place. If you ever get to France, I encourage you to go. And when I went, we had a very good tour guide, and she talked about how King Louis would have these great parties. He was a great host. He would serve wine and coffee and tea, but nobody would drink the coffee. And I asked, well, was the coffee that bad? He said, no, the coffee was the best that you could get at the time. But the king didn't drink coffee, so nobody else drank coffee. He only drank tea and wine, so they only drank tea and wine. So it's sort of lemmings sort of thing, following the leader. Anyway, sort of an interesting diversion there. But so don't say axe and don't say nuclear. Say ask and nuclear. You get the pronunciations correct. If you are ever giving a speech and you get a word that you have to use, look it up. I mean, you may look at it in the dictionary. It still doesn't. You're still not sure of the pronunciation. Type that word into YouTube. Somebody saying that word, and try a few different videos because somebody may not quite pronounce it the same way. You want to pronounce words correctly because if you don't, you lose credibility. Anyway, there's also issues of dialect, and these are regional. For instance, in the Northeast United States, where we are, and the North in general, we tend to put the emphasis, the accent on a later syllable where in the South United States or in England, they tend to put the accent on the first syllable. So for example, police versus police. In this area, we tend to say police, but if you go down south, they'll say police. Or, you know, in the England, they'll tend to say police as opposed to police. Insurance versus insurance. This is one I actually had to deal with. I shouldn't have revealed it, but I had, when I worked at the pharmaceutical company, I had this Australian gentleman come to me. He says, I need you to have, I need you to make me up a brochure. I'm sorry, a what? A brochure. I had no idea what he was talking about. And they said, oh, I know. I need you to make me up a brochure. You know, he mocked me. He mocked the American accent. So I became very aware of the different pronunciations. So anytime I'm speaking to a British or Australian audience or a person, I'll put the emphasis more on the second syllable, more on the first syllable, so they can understand me better. I'm not saying mock anyone's accent. That's not what I'm saying, but you might have to shift your pronunciations just a little bit to be understood. So, the rate at which you speak is also important. Here's a sort of interesting thing. People who were born or raised, or their parents were born or raised near the equator tend to speak slower than people who were born or live farther from the equator. Does anyone know why? Anyone have a guess? Come on, somebody has to have a theory. Think about it a little bit. What would be different between the difference between somebody living near the equator and far away from the equator?
My guess would be that things are more slow paced, while America's more fast paced. I would say that. That would be my guess.
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to do with America, but why? Why would it be slower paced closer to the equator?
It's hotter.
Bingo! It's hotter, and speaking takes up energy. You are expending energy, and so they do tend to speak slower because they are conserving energy, and so you want to be careful of that. Also, people who live in urban areas tend to speak faster than people who are in non-urban areas. My father, who used to work in New York, would speak to people all over the world, and they always said he talked really fast. And he realized that eventually it was an urban thing. So in general, I would encourage most of you probably to speak a little slower. I rarely tell, I think I've only twice in 18 years told, or maybe 11 years, told people to speak faster, only twice. Most people speak too fast, usually because they're nervous and they want to get away from the podium faster. It was interesting. I actually had one student a few years ago. She spoke really fast. And I mean, really super fast. It was like she was speed reading or something. And I said, yeah, I need to speak slower. And you get this frustration that I didn't get from most students who I expressed this to. And I said, and eventually we had to talk about it. I said, Professor, you tell me to slow down, but my grandmother keeps on telling me, she says I speak too slow and I need to speak faster. I couldn't imagine anyone telling her to speak any faster. And it just turned out, just by pure coincidence, that I didn't even realize I knew her aunt. And we were talking about languages and speaking, and at this group networking group I was with, and she said, "Oh, yeah, that's my niece." And I said, "Well, can you tell me why her grandmother tells her to speed up?" "Oh, because her grandmother's French." And it took me a moment to realize. Now I all of a sudden understood. The French language actually has fewer words than English, and so to express the same idea, they need to use more words. So, for instance, well, if I were to, we have the word drugstore. They don't have French does not have a word for drugstore. Most French people will say le drugstore. You know, they'll just, and a lot of languages borrow words from one another. We've borrowed French words, and they've borrowed English words. Although I do know that in France there is a council of academics who are trying to purge the French language of any non-French words. They want their people to say the store that sells pharmaceuticals, as opposed to say the drugstore. So to get the same amount of ideas out in the same time, they actually have to speak faster to use more words. So that's, and I experienced that because I had to have one of my videos translated to French, and when I looked at the script was much longer, but I didn't realize at the time that they would speak faster. So, in terms of what you will do, I would encourage you to speak clearly, and however rate you are, that's it. However, sometimes you will want to slow down to make a point, or speed up to make a point. You know, you can go both ways. Again, coming back, you want variation in your delivery to make emphasize points. Pauses are okay. We talked about disfluency. I would rather hear a pause than hear somebody go, you know, that sort of thing. In fact, in some cases, a pause can really help. I don't know if some of you have heard there's a great John Kennedy quote, and it goes, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And he was trying to, you know, be patriotic. And if you think about it, okay, actually the pause in the middle helps make it work. Ask not what your country can do for you. Okay, I understand that. And then he turns it around. Oh, I know what you did. You turned it around. Ask what you can do for your country. And that pause in the middle gives people a moment to process the first half of the quote, and then they understand the last half of the quote better. So it's okay to pause. You don't want to pause too long, or people think you've forgotten what you're going to say. But pausing also gives you the time to breathe, you know, to get another another breath of air, and so what you say will be, you know, with more. You'll have more power to your words. They'll be louder and clearer. Okay. Okay. The use of microphones. In many places, you will need to use microphones. Yeah, obviously, we're all using microphones now. But these microphones are also somewhat self-adjusting because they're being put through a computer. But most microphones are not. You know, so if you're in an auditorium with a microphone, and there are various types of microphones that you might come across. A stationary microphone. You know, let's say this is a microphone. It's you know, on a stand, held down. You know, it might be on a long stand or a short stand or on a table or on a podium, you know, a podium stand. You also have hand mics where you can move around. You usually hold them, and like if you're interviewing somebody. Boom mics, which are usually, you won't experience those except in TV studios, and they hang, and you usually don't see them unless they accidentally dip down in the picture. The lavalier microphone is one that actually is clipped on. You know, it clips onto a collar or a tie or a lapel. And those are very good. They're very, you know, close to you. As you move, it goes with you. The one thing, it may kind of scrape up against the fabric, sort of making that kind of voice. I don't know if you actually can pick up that sound or not, but you're rubbing against the cloth. So you want to avoid that. Headset microphones have become into vogue in the last 10 years, where it sort of loops over the ear, and the microphone is sort of like here. and it's not in front. They don't put it in front of the mouth because they don't want to pick up the breath. Only when you speak. They just want the sound. So, and they're usually fairly discreet. You're seeing a lot more of these on stage, and singers and things like that, who are doing a lot of dancing and moving around. So the microphones are great, but you do need to do a sound check, because usually there's a level control. And you may see somebody, again, this is the microphone, you see somebody come up the microphone and go, testing 1, 2, 3. That is the worst kind of sound check you can do. Anyone know why? What did I do wrong when I went testing 1, 2, 3?
You move closer to the mic.
Right, and I spoke louder. I mean, what you want to do is when you do a sound check is that you want to do it in your normal voice. And in fact, it's better if you actually have a speech to give. That's great. Start giving this speech. Recently, they've uncovered Richard Nixon's sound check. Now, I know that was before most of you were born, probably all of you. Something from my childhood, but I remember it very clearly. Richard Nixon's resignation speech. And recently they found the sound check, and it starts with, okay, everyone get out of the room. Mike gets to stay, he's the technician. Okay, and he starts to deliver it, and it's exactly like he's doing a manuscript speech. It was like watching the actual resignation speech, which was very emotional for the country, the president resigning. Although it doesn't seem quite as dramatic compared to what's going on these days, but it was a big deal. And it felt like he was watching the exact speech. And then just before he is about to say, I will resign as of noon tomorrow, he doesn't say that because he didn't want the technician to know, the give away the big deal, the big news. So not a great president, but did a great sound check. So you want to be aware of that. And you might want to have an operator, monitoring, because sometimes people get louder or softer as they go on. So you want somebody, if you can, to have somebody monitor that. It's also important to understand that microphones will amplify your mistakes too. Never say anything you wouldn't want to say. Tell anyone. If there's a microphone in the room, be careful. Politicians, of course, are really been caught by that many times. To me, I think one of the most famous examples in recent history was after the Affordable Care Act was passed by Congress. President Obama came out and made an announcement, and afterwards he was hugged by Joe Biden, who said, "Mr. President, this is a big fucking deal." And what Joe Biden didn't realize is that Barack Obama still had the microphone on him. And so that was recorded for posterity. Forever we will have that, that will be recorded. And there have been a lot of other examples of that sort of thing as well. I was actually at a wedding one time, and very nice wedding. It was in a big Catholic church, full house, lots of people there. Very nice ceremony. The priest used a lavalier microphone, so he liked to walk around a bit as he gave his sermon. That was fine. Did the vows, and then the happy couple walked out. The priest followed, and then the rest of us. We were not particularly close to this couple, but we were kind of halfway back. And so people are pouring out. We're waiting patiently, and all of a sudden we start hearing this very personal conversation between the priest and somebody else over the speakers. He never turned off the microphone, never disconnected it, and everyone in the church is hearing this very personal conversation. And all of a sudden you saw a flash down the side of somebody started running out to have him turn off the microphone, and got it turned off just before it really started to get juicy. So be aware of microphones. They can betray you as well. Be aware of other things, the sound levels, pops, where all of a sudden you start speaking louder. Any nearby speakers, and you might have experienced where the microphone and the speaker get too close together and they get that high-pitched, squeaky feedback. We've had a little of that in our class here because people have had their microphones on, and that's why I asked you to turn your microphones off unless you want to speak, so we can avoid any of that screechy feedback. You also want to be aware of the inverse square law. Now, don't know how many of you, unless you took a physics class, you're not probably familiar with the inverse square law. So let's take a look. Here is our speaker. And here's the microphone. And we're going to say this microphone is one unit from the mouth. It can be 1 inch, 1 foot, doesn't matter. Okay, whatever that distance is. And we're going to set the volume to 1, whatever that volume is. Okay, if you move the microphone twice the distance, you're only going to get a quarter of the sound level, quarter of the volume. It's called the inverse square law. The 2 squared is 4. The inverse of 4 is 1/4. And so if you go 3 times the distance, it's 1/9 the volume level, and so forth and so on. Now, this may not seem very important. However, if I'm holding a microphone here, this is my microphone. I don't know if I have anything better than this, and then I turn my head, I've tripled the distance. And I've seen people that they're speaking like this, and then they turn their head and they can barely hear them. And then they have to turn back here, and then it goes back and forth. The best thing, if you have a microphone, put it at your chin. And that way, no matter which way you turn, the sound level will be the same. I really got burned by the inverse square law one time. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the concept of a prize patrol. The various clearinghouse sweepstakes used to do that. Maybe they still do. And the idea is that somebody wins a prize, but they don't know it, and they send a camera and balloons and a giant check and everything, and they surprise the person. So somebody at my company decided we had sold the 1 millionth bottle of our product, and they knew who bought it and they knew who sold it. So the idea was the person who made the 1 millionth purchase, they knew it. They knew, and they contacted them, but then they decided they're going to they give him a prize, and there was going to be a Lincoln Navigator, which is a pretty nice gift. And then they're also going to give one to the sales clerk who sold the 1 millionth bottle. So the woman's name was Lisa, and she sold the bottle down in Mississippi in a store that she worked in. So I flew down to Mississippi with my crew, and I met at the airport by the local sales rep, who's a bit upset with me. How come you're coming into my sales territory? You didn't tell me. He's going on, and I said, "Hey, Zach, I'm sorry. I had met him before." I said, "Zach, I'm sorry. I thought you knew about this. I'm just given a certain assignment here. I'm just trying to do my job here. How about if you be the person who tells Lisa that she won?" And all of a sudden he was happy with that. And all of a sudden, so the next morning we went out to the store. The owner of the store was in on it. He knew what was going to happen. So we set up our camera and everything outside, and unfortunately, it was on a main road. And so I said, "Zach, okay, when you speak to Lisa, keep the microphone close to the mouth, because there's this inverse square law. There's there's a lot of loud traffic here, so I need the microphone to be close to the mouth so I can hear what's being said over that noise." And he said, okay, fine. So we got on a cell phone. I called the owner. The owner went to Lisa and said, "Lisa, there's some people outside with a camera. Can you see what's going on?" And so Lisa comes out, and Zach says, "Are you Lisa?" I can't remember what the last name was. And she goes, "Yeah." "Did you know that you sold the 1 millionth bottle of Ivomec?" "No, I didn't know." He's interviewing her. but he's never moving the microphone from his own mouth. So we can't hear what Lisa is saying. And so he completely screwed up the surprise. I mean, we moved the camera into the warehouse and we kind of did a new, different kind of thing there. But that's the way it goes. So I'll never forgive Zach for screwing that up, but maybe I should have explained it to him better. But that's where it goes. So you want to be aware of the microphones and how close you are, and that's why I think probably the best thing is just keep it under the mouth. But if you're interviewing someone, you got to move the microphone to that person. When you're delivering your speech, you need to get lots of rest. I encourage don't try to stay up all night the night before. You want to look rested. You want to feel rested. Arrive early because you want to. First of all, I always like to get places early so I can check out, see if there's a problem with the venue. I think I mentioned previously I went to one that was too hot, and another one was too cold, and one was too big, and so forth. I also feel I want to have those last, I have a little time to sort of go over my speech just before I speak. If I'm getting there just in the nick of time, I'm probably going to get nervous and get sweaty and, perspire and all that. So I think it's good to get someplace early. Also, it may reassure people who you're speaking before. If they don't see you, they start to get nervous. And I would encourage everyone to visualize success. Don't worry about failing. Imagine what it's going to be like when you just nail it. You just, absolutely hit it perfectly. You're in a better mood. I was speaking to somebody about running, and this person was I don't want to say professional, but a real athlete. And he said the worst thing you could, and he would run through, not simply on tracks, but they would do like cross country through the wilderness kind of thing. And he said, if I see out there a route, and if I worry about tripping over that route, I'm probably going to trip over it. So I don't worry about the route. I only imagine myself blasting by it. And because if I think about that route, I'm going to trip over it. I'm going to focus on it too much. So imagine you giving the greatest speech of all time, and that will improve your odds of delivering a great speech. Okay. Excuse me. More and more of us are speaking on video. Actually, this class is a perfect example, an unexpected example of that. Now, these are sort of low resolution cameras that we're all using, but you want to keep in mind certain things. Generally, you want to tone down the gestures, doing wild sort of things. This is kind of very distracting. So, keep your gestures small, don't do this whole thing. That's kind of, and also a lot of, here, my arms are actually going outside the frame. You can't see what I'm doing with my hands. So keep your gestures, tone them down. Also pay attention to what you're wearing. Now, you should not be wearing something with big letters on them, unless it's related to your topic. Okay, so that's kind of important. You want to, particularly if you're going to a studio, you want to avoid all white because they may blow out. I don't know if any of you ever saw the Superman movie from the 1980s with Christopher Reeves. The first scene in that movie is the Kryptonian elders judging General Zod, and they're wearing clothes that were it looks like it was made out of light bulb. Their clothes are glowing. It was actually a special effect, a very actually easy special effect called material called Scotch-Brite. And then they if you put the light in a certain place, it makes it look like it's glowing. It's the same stuff they put on stop signs to make them glow from a distance when your headlights see them. Anyway, if you are wearing all white and the camera is not set right, you could look like you're glowing. It's kind of distracting from you. You don't want to be distracting. You also want to be careful of extreme darks. Medium dark is fine, but wearing all black makes you look a little like Darth Vader. In some cases, it can be worse. I used to, Well, these things that are called black curtain shows. These are shows. These are inexpensive shows done in usually local studios, where they just have a black curtain and put some chairs and a table or plant. And actually, Zach Galifianakis does this show, Between Two Ferns. He's really mocking those types of shows. They don't do too many of them anymore. But anyway, I was working on one of these, and this guy comes into the studio, and he's wearing a black turtleneck, and he walks onto the set on it with a black background. It looks like his head was floating in space. So you want to be careful about going all black, in terms of your clothes. You want to avoid heavy patterns. You can get strange moire patterns. Like if there's two screens together, they create this strange sort of vibrating pattern. Keep your clothes simple. Solid or solid-ish colors are the best. Now, this shirt I'm wearing is not perfectly solid, but it's almost solid, and that's fine. You want to avoid heavy, shiny jewelry as well. I remember there's this one woman, she was in the studio, and she wore these these earrings that are quite beautiful. They were like maple leaves, and I think they were metallic. And they're beautiful earrings. The trouble is, whenever she turned a little bit, there would be an odd, strange reflection off her ear. It's like the flash going off on her ear. So you want to be careful of overly heavy or shiny jewelry. You also want to wear clothing that is slimming. And you may have heard the term, the camera adds 10 pounds or 5 pounds or whatever. And that, strangely enough, has to do with the nature of pixels. For instance, let's see if I can. Yeah, I'm going to switch to the whiteboard here. Let's see. I can do this. Okay, so this is like your typical pixel here. However, video pixels are slightly more rectangular. They do actually add some weight. So you want to have things that are a little, I don't want to say super tight, but not too pillowy. You want things that are a little bit more slender. So be careful about that. Slimming. And also you kind of want to avoid horizontal stripes. That they will make you look wider. So, all right. At the end of your speech, first of all, are there any questions here? I've been going on for a while. Any questions? No. Okay. At the end of your speech, you're expected, in a majority of cases, to answer questions. So you should anticipate those questions. If there's a question you do not want to answer, guaranteed somebody will ask it. So you want to prepare, anticipate any questions that you might be asked, do a little research, be able to deal with that. In some cases, you may want to rephrase a question that an audience member has asked. For instance, if some audience member hasn't really thought out the question too well, and they're kind of in a very impromptu way asking a question, it's a little convoluted, you might want to repeat it for the audience in a simpler fashion. Say, so what you're really asking me is, and then put it in a form that's easier for you to answer. Another reason to do this is if you have a microphone and the audience member doesn't. So you may need to repeat the question for the audience so they understand what question you're actually answering. You also want to stay on message. One of the reasons for this is that you will have questioners who may have completely different interests, and that may have nothing to do with your topic or little to do with your topic. Or you may have people with agendas who want to get a whole another speech going, or bring up something, maybe even bring up something embarrassing. But you want to say that, and you can say, well, that's outside of the scope of what I'm talking about today. So, or give them a short answer. Don't be pulled into somebody else's web, somebody else's labyrinth. Just stay on your message. And usually, you have a point that you want to make, and so stick to it. Sorry. When you're responding to a question, respond to the entire audience, not just that one person who's asked the question. And the reason for that is it may seem like you're having a private conversation now. So, listen to the person and then answer to, you start looking at them, but then you look at everybody and answer that question. You also want to listen non-judgmentally. There is that expression, there's no such thing as a stupid question. But in our hearts, sometimes we think there are stupid questions out there. Don't look, give a look, expression on your face like this is a stupid question. Listen non-judgmentally. Don't ever demean an audience member. Certainly not in front of the rest of the audience. And that can work, because that can backfire on you. For instance, and don't get into an argument with an audience member. During the 2000 debate, where George Bush and Al Gore were debating, somebody had asked a question. Al Gore had answered it, and now George Bush was answering it. And while George Bush was answering the question, Al Gore would go, give these really loud sighs, like, oh, he's so stupid, just saying that with the sigh. And it made him look really petty. In fact, guess what the sketch on Saturday Night Live was the following Saturday night? It was I think it's Darrell Hammond who did the impressions of Al Gore, just sighing at everything. In fact, Al Gore's campaign team showed him that video of Saturday Night Live to get him to stop doing it, because he had a feeling it looked like he was going to keep on doing that, and he didn't realize how petty it made him look. So you kind of want to avoid that. Don't attack an audience member with your answer as well. About 10 years ago, during the financial crisis, the mortgage crisis, we were in a deep recession, and there was a congressman named Barney Frank from the Boston area. He was the chair of the House Banking Committee, Finance and Banking Committee, and he was in his home district giving a talk at Harvard University. He was invited as a guest. He gave his talk, and one of the questioners was a student who said, Congressman, knowing what you know now, is there anything, what could you have done, if anything, to prevent this crisis? Now, that's a tough question, but it's also a respectful question. He kind of gave a couple of escape hatches in there, saying, first off, knowing what you know now, hindsight is very easy to answer, and nobody blames people for not knowing the future. And also he said, if anything, so Barney Frank could have said, well, no, there was nothing we could have done, or he could have given another answer about hindsight. And instead, what he did is he responded with, I'm so sick of you conservatives, ripping us apart, blah, blah, blah. Now, Harvard is not a bastion of conservative thinking. I don't know about the student who actually asked the question, but it was a respectful question. Yes, it was a tough question. And Barney Frank really treated him badly. Guess what the next question was? From, there was two microphones. It went back and forth. A woman said, why do you think you can treat our students like that? And it became a very confrontational thing. And it really didn't need to be. Barney Frank and Harvard, the Harvard community are usually fairly close to in their feelings and their positions. And he just created a hostile audience where there didn't need to be one. So never attack an audience member. Now, occasionally you will get a hostile question. I remember when I was in graduate school, I was making a presentation, and there was this one guy who was always looking to, I know him, he was always looking to embarrass people or show that they were wrong. He'd even try to show the professors they were wrong. And he asked me a question, and it was set up, he was set up to attack, and I simply said no to his question, and then I quickly moved on to the next person. And and he was constantly trying to ask another question, and I wouldn't call on him again because I knew that he was a hostile audience member. But I didn't embarrass him. I didn't make him look bad. I didn't get into an argument with him, because you really don't know that you can win those arguments unless you're amazing at that sort of thing. But you never know about how amazing that audience member is about arguing. So you want to be careful about that. Neutralize hostile questions. This is easier said than done. I just gave you an example of how I neutralized one, but there are different ways. Just don't get into arguments with your audience. Just say, well, that's outside the scope of what we're talking about tonight, or anything like that. Find some way not to get into a fight with somebody. Be brief. Don't go nuts about. Don't start another speech. If you're being asked a question, just take your time. I mean, answer the question thoroughly, but don't go on and deliver another speech. One of the criticisms of Barack Obama was that when people asked him questions, he would he'd give really, really long answers, which people may or may not be interested in. So, answer the question to the needs of that questioner, or however far you thinks it needs to be answered, but don't go overboard. If you don't know something, admit it. Now, I guarantee that each one of you knows something about something that I don't, more than I do, on some topic. If I don't know something and I make something up, you may call me on it. We also live in the age of Google, and everyone's got access to Google on these devices. And so while I'm talking or answering a question, you could be looking up something on Google or some other site, and then say, wait a minute, Google says this, or not. Well, Google doesn't say anything, but some site that Google led you to will say something. So if you don't know something, admit it. I respect when people say, I'm not really sure about the answer on that. That means they're a thoughtful person. I actually knew somebody who actually always seemed to have an answer for whatever question he had, you had for him. And whenever he answered a question about something I knew something about, I realized that he didn't know what he was talking about, and which made me question that when we was asked questions in areas that I wasn't familiar with, and he gave answers, how could I depend upon those answers? And he really lost credibility with me. Don't be a know-it-all. If you don't know something, admit it. Don't. Your ego may want to make something up, but don't. We live in a world where too many people are making things up, and we want to avoid that. It's also okay to indicate that there are limits to the question and answer period. You don't have to take questions forever. I used to work these stockholder meetings for one particular corporation, and every year. I don't think you've probably never been to a stockholder meeting, but they're kind of interesting in that. Yes, stockholders come, but not the big stockholders. They already know the information. The financial analysts send their junior associates to it. You might be interested to find out that most people who go to stockholder meetings are retirees. These are people who have time on their hands, and usually they come for the food. It's just something to do. My father used to work at a completely different company, stockholder meetings, and he'd see all these retirees fighting over the Danish, and they're taking the food and putting it in bags and trying to go off with it, and it's kind of a funny thing. My father's big solution was buy boxes of cookies and let them take the cookies. They're smaller and more of them. With the ones I worked at, never had any trouble with the food, and I wasn't part of that part. A stockholder meeting generally goes as follows. There is a presentation made by the CEO or the CFO about where the company's going strategically, that sort of thing. Then there's about 5-10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes of voting. And the voting, most of it's already done by time the meeting has happened. And then there's a question and answer period where the CEO will answer any questions that any shareholder poses. And it was funny. This was a pharmaceutical company, so it was almost funny. There's almost always three seats every year reserved for a certain type of person. One was usually an older woman who was complaining, why did the drugs cost so much? Which, if you're a stockholder, you want the drugs to cost a lot so you can get better dividends. The second one chair was, imaginary chair, was usually for somebody from the religious community who had a problem with stem cell research. And the third one was usually an employee, a union employee from a distant manufacturing site who for some reason wanted to embarrass the CEO, which never worked. And there were lots of other questions too. And the CEO would always say, Rishi, after 45 minutes of questions, I only have 5 more minutes, or I'll only take 3 more questions. And by 50 minutes, he was done and out. And I commented to somebody about this. Why is it always 50 minutes? Why doesn't he just stay on for the entire hour? And this person said, well, 50 minutes is the witching hour. I go, what do you mean the witching hour? He says, it's when people start to make mistakes. And he pointed out the presidential debate from 1976, where Gerald Ford was president and he was debating Jimmy Carter, who wanted to become president. And somebody asked a question about the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia. And President Gerald Ford said, there is no Soviet domination of Czechoslovakia. And everyone's jaw dropped because the Soviets had invaded Czechoslovakia not that long before. So people thought, oh my God, he's crazy, he's incompetent. And my friend said, no, he was just an older gentleman who was tired. He made a mistake. He'd been on his feet for 50 minutes. And, and that's what happens. And that's when people make mistakes. So, and so he pointed to our CEO, and he's an older man too. And he's been on his feet for longer than 50 minutes. And so that he knows when to when he's getting tired, and he stops it. You rarely would ever encounter yourself have to do a Q&A session that would last more than 50 minutes. Probably our Q&A sessions in the class will be probably no more than 5 minutes. So, you don't have to go on forever, but you don't want to abruptly stop it either. You say, I have time for 2 more questions, or I have only 5 more minutes for questions. So you let people know that the Q&A period is coming to an end. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? I only have time for 2 more questions. No. Nobody has any